The Vietnam Air War is always depicted as a mismatch. The overwhelming power of the US military versus a rudimentary, creative enemy. But in December 1966, that assumption was being broken. Over the rice paddies north of Hanoi, the men of the 921st Fighter Regiment were winning a war they had no business winning. In 31 days, the regiment shot down 14 American F-105 Thunderchiefs and did not lose a single MiG in return. The consequence was immediate. More than 1 in 5 American strike missions ended with the bombers panicking, jettisoning their loads into empty jungle and turning for home. The most powerful air force in human history was being held off the targets it had been ordered to destroy by a few dozen pilots flying a Soviet interceptor that did not even carry an internal gun. It was humiliating. The 921st was called Saudo, Red Star, and almost none of its pilots had driven a car before they learned to fly. They'd been rice farmers, mechanics, and schoolboys. The Soviets pulled them off bicycles, taught them Russian in 18 months, and handed them MiG-17s at Krasnodar. The doctrine they brought home had been written for the open skies of Eastern Europe. The men of the 921st had to bend it to a country where the enemy came in over jungle ridgelines and rained napalm and destruction over their homeland. The regiment had been outclassed in every measurable category from the day it was commissioned. Aircraft numbers, training depth, weapon sophistication, and combat hours. There was no rotation pipeline. The Americans flew 100 missions and went home to their families. The men of the 921st flew until the war ended, until they were shot down, or until they were too injured to climb back into the cockpit. What they had instead was a doctrine that, against all odds, was working. Their Soviet instructors had taught them not to dogfight Americans. Do not match them turn for turn. Do not duel. The MiG-21 was a knife, not a sword. Slash through the bomber formations from above, fire the heat-seeking missile, and run for home before the escort fighters could return the favor. The MiG's job was not to win duels. The MiG's job was to ruin bombing runs. If possible, take down an American. More often, they accomplished the mission without firing a shot, because frightened F-105 pilots had already pickled their bombs into the jungle the moment a MiG call came over the radio. The whole system was orchestrated from the ground. Vietnamese ground control intercept officers, working from radar plots in concrete bunkers around Hanoi, vectored the MiGs onto the bombers by voice command. The pilot in the air heard a heading and an altitude in his headset, climbed, fired, and dove away. He often never saw the aircraft he was shooting at, except as a flash through cloud cover. By December, the controllers had become surgical. American signals intelligence was leaking everywhere. The 921st could distinguish a vulnerable F-105 strike package from a more dangerous F-4 escort flight by the electronic signature of its jamming pods alone, before the aircraft were even visible in radar. The Americans flew the same routes, the same altitudes, the same call signs, the same predictable schedules down the limestone ridgeline they themselves had nicknamed Thud Ridge. The 921st had effectively memorized them. By New Year's Eve, the men in the regiment believed they had solved the American problem. One of those men was a 24-year-old pilot named Nguyễn Văn Cốc. On December 14, 1966, Cốc was flying his first combat sortie in the MiG-21. He was attached as wingman to his squadron commander, climbing through cloud on a vector from ground control when the Thunderchiefs came into view below him. His leader committed. Cốc followed. He fired one K-13 Atoll heat-seeking missile and watched an F-105D break apart in the air. He'd only been operational for 1 year. He was 24 years old, from Bac province, the kind of rural district north of Hanoi where most boys his age were still working in the family rice plots. His older brother had been lost to a French airstrike during the First Indochina War. Cốc enlisted in the Vietnamese People's Air Force in 1961 and was sent to the Soviet Union for 4 years of training at Bataisk and Krasnodar. Of the 120 Vietnamese trainees in his cohort, he was one of 7 to graduate as MiG-17 pilots. when the Soviets began supplying North Vietnam with their newest fighter, he was selected and sent back to Russia again. He returned home in mid-1965 with 6 other graduates. By December 1966, he was flying with the 921st. It only took him a year to shoot down his first American. In the regimental pecking order, he was still nobody. A junior pilot, a wingman, not yet trusted to lead an element. What set him apart was a temperament his instructors had noted from his earliest hours in the MiG-17. He did not improvise. He flew the brief. He fired inside parameters. When ground control gave him a heading, he took the heading. When the engagement geometry was wrong, he disengaged. Among a cohort of young men flying the most exciting machine in their lives, Cok was the one who treated the cockpit like an office. The MiG-21 PF he climbed into for every sortie was as advanced a weapon as the Soviets were willing to export. A light, delta-winged airframe with rapid acceleration to supersonic speed, no internal gun, and 2 K-13 Atoll heat-seeking missiles slung beneath the wings. A single pilot, dependent on the voice in his headset for everything beyond visual range. Through the rest of December and into the first days of January, he ran routine ground-controlled intercepts against F-105 strike packages along Thud Ridge. He was one of the few Vietnamese pilots giving the Americans a run for their money. When the radar room at Phuoc Yen picked up an incoming American formation at a little before 3 o'clock on the afternoon of January 2nd, 1967, the controllers saw exactly what they expected to see. The weather had been terrible all day, a solid floor of cloud up to 7,000 feet with no sign of breaking, and the morning had passed without contact. The signature on the scope was textbook Rolling Thunder, the QRC-160 jamming pattern blooming across the screen, the formation spacing of bomb-laden Thunderchiefs, the flight path tracking down Thud Ridge toward Hanoi, the radio chatter on the right frequencies in the right voices. Cok ran to his MiG-21, strapped in, lit the afterburner, and climbed into the overcast with his element. The voice in his headset gave him heading and altitude. The K-13s on his wings were armed. He'd done this dozens of times in the past month. He was flying into the same brief that had produced 14 shootdowns in December. The MiGs climbed through the clouds in trail formation, breaking through in sequence as ground control directed. The lead pilots punched up into clear sky first, looking for the usual lumbering F-105s lined up like targets in a gunnery range. When the pilots ahead of him saw the silhouettes, the radio traffic changed. They were not Thunderchiefs. These weren't even escort fighters. They were F-4 Phantoms carrying air-to-air missiles. The maneuvering was odd. The lead pilots tried to call the warning across the radio. Some of them had already committed to their attack runs and could not break off cleanly. Others were already inside the firing envelope with the Phantoms above them, and the Phantoms were already firing. The pilots of the 921st had been trained to slash and escape. They'd been trained to fight bombers. They were now in a pure air superiority duel against the most lethal fighters in the U.S. Air Force, and the Americans had altitude on them. Cok, emerging from the clouds last, saw the engagement already underway above him. He saw missile trails, a MiG-21 cartwheeling with one wing torn off. He saw Phantoms turning into firing positions with the unhurried efficiency of men who'd been waiting in those positions for 40 minutes. He'd flown into something he did not yet understand. 12 minutes. That was the entire duration of the engagement. Pilots breaking left, breaking right, diving back into the overcast they'd just climbed out of. Missiles in the air with their motors still burning. Radio traffic in 3 languages. Vietnamese pilot to pilot. Vietnamese ground control trying to keep up with a battle they could not see. And overlapping fragments of English from the Americans calling out their victories. When it was over, 5 MiG-21s were lost. The Americans claimed 7. Vietnamese records confirmed 5. Even that was catastrophic. It represented roughly a third of the operational MiG-21 force in North Vietnamese service. Cok's last seconds in the cockpit are unclear. Some accounts say his MiG was struck by an AIM-9 Sidewinder from behind. Others say he ran low on fuel during the chaotic engagement and ejected over friendly territory before his aircraft came down. Both versions land in the same place. Somewhere over the rice paddies north of Hanoi, the 24-year-old pilot pulled the ejection handle and was blown clear of his MiG-21. A parachute opened over flooded farmland. The most important sortie of his career had ended with him hanging under nylon, weaponless, 8,000 feet above the ground. Across the surrounding countryside, 4 other men at the 921st were also descending under canopies, scattered across the rural districts of the Red River Delta. Every one of them survived. Not a single Vietnamese pilot lost his life on January 2, 1967. 5 MiGs were lost. 5 parachutes opened. 5 men were returned to friendly hands and returned to their regiment within hours. In the GCI radar room at Phuc Yen, controllers watched their force collapse off the screen, called the surviving aircraft home, and began the work of trying to understand what had just happened. Cok did not yet know what had happened either. He believed in that moment that his career was finished. He had lost the state-of-the-art jet that had been given to only a handful of men. He was wrong about all of it. Across the next 48 hours, the picture came together in fragments. Interrogation of the surviving pilots, cross-checking of radio traffic against the American voices the controllers had heard, recovery of missile debris from the wreckage of the downed MiGs across the rice paddies and villages of the Red River Delta, AIM-7 Sparrows, AIM-9 Sidewinders, flying for air-to-air combat, and nothing else. The first conclusion was the hardest one. The Americans had not sent bombers down Thud Ridge at all. They had sent fighters dressed as bombers. The QRC-160 jamming pods, the formation spacing, the call signs, the radio voices, the altitudes, and the timing, all of them were fake. The signature on the Phuc Yen radar scope that the controllers had read as a textbook Rolling Thunder strike package had been engineered, line by line, to read that way. Phuc Yen had vectored its MiGs into an ambush built around the regiment's own predictable habits. The second conclusion was harder than the first. The Americans had been studying the 921st for months. They knew the routes the controllers favored. They knew the altitudes the MiG-21s preferred for their intercepts. They knew which radio frequencies the regiment monitored and which call signs the controllers responded to without hesitation. They knew, in short, everything the regiment had been doing right through December. They'd used every piece of it to design the trap. The hot streak had not been invisible to the Americans. It had been studied. The operation, the regiment learned in the weeks that followed, had a name. The Americans called it Bolo. The colonel who designed it was a man named Robin Olds, a fighter pilot from another war who had spent the last decade being told the Air Force no longer needed men like him. He had arrived at his command at Ubon in Thailand 3 months earlier with 18 lost F-4s on his books and orders to stop the bleeding. He could not attack the MiG bases directly. Phuc Yen, Kep, Gelam, all of them sat inside a political sanctuary the Johnson administration had drawn around Hanoi to avoid killing Soviet or Chinese advisors and triggering a wider war. The MiGs took off, climbed, attacked, and returned to ground he was forbidden to touch. The same sanctuary that protected the 921st had forced Olds to invent something more dangerous than bombs. He had to make the MiGs come up. He had made them come up. In the briefing rooms at Phuc Yen, the senior officers at the VAPF and the Soviet advisory mission reached the same conclusion the Americans had reached 3 months earlier, working in the opposite direction. Predictability was a weapon. The Americans had used the regiment's predictability to destroy a third of its operational strength in 12 minutes. If the regiment did not change, the Americans would do it again. For the Vietnamese, the urgent question was why the Americans had been able to do it. The answer began in the briefing rooms. Within 48 hours of the engagement, VAPF headquarters grounded the entire MiG-21 force. No operational sorties, no training flights, no exceptions. The remaining pilots of the 921st were pulled off the schedule and ordered into the after-action review that would, in retrospect, shape Vietnamese air doctrine for the rest of the war. The mood among the Vietnamese was almost forensic. The review listed the errors plainly and without emotion. The pilots had broken through the clouds too quickly, popping out one by one instead of in organized pairs, and failed to join up into a proper combat formation before the engagement. They walked straight into a fight on the Phantom's terms, giving the Americans every measurable advantage: altitude, energy, surprise, and numbers. They'd been baited into a stand-up duel, exactly the kind of fight the MiG-21 was never designed to win. The conclusion the review reached was harder than the failure itself. The doctrine that had served the regiment so brilliantly through December, slash, fire, escape, never duel, had not failed at Bolo. They had abandoned it. Under the pressure of an unexpected encounter, the surviving pilots had improvised, and improvisation had cost them 5 aircraft and the fighting reputation of the entire regiment. The reform was systematic. New tactical formations were drawn up, between 2 and 4 aircraft per attack, never more than 10 on a single mission. A mixed-altitude doctrine was developed, in which MiG-17s would slash at American formations from the sides, while MiG-21s struck from above. The rules of engagement were rewritten in absolute terms. Never accept a head-on pass from a Phantom. The F-4 carried 4 AIM-7 Sparrow radar-guided missiles that could fire from miles away, before the MiG pilot ever saw the aircraft launching at him. The MiG-21's K-13 was a heat seeker. It needed to be behind the target, close enough to lock onto the exhaust. A nose-to-nose merge handed the Phantom every advantage the Phantom had. The new doctrine was absolute. If a Phantom appeared on the nose, the MiG turned away, always. Even if it meant breaking off an attack already in progress. Even if it meant abandoning a wingman who had not yet seen the threat. Never enter a turning fight. The Phantom was heavier, faster in the dive, and carried 2 crewmen who could split the workload of flying and fighting. The MiG-21 was lighter and could outturn the Phantom in a single hard bank, but only once. After the first turn, the MiG bled energy faster than the Phantom could, and a turning fight that lasted longer than 30 seconds ended with the Phantom on the MiG's tail. The new doctrine treated a second turn as unthinkable. 1 pass, 1 missile, 1 decision, then out. Always disengage if surprise is lost. The K-13 had a single useful firing geometry. From the rear, inside 3 kilometers, against an unaware target. Outside that geometry, it was a liability. It told the Americans where the MiG was. It announced an attack that could no longer succeed. The new doctrine required the pilot to assess the engagement in the seconds before firing, and to abort if any of the parameters had slipped. A MiG that turned for home without firing had not failed. A MiG that fired into a lost surprise geometry had wasted its only chance to come home at all. Soviet tacticians worked the chalkboards alongside Vietnamese squadron leaders. The regiment was rebuilt from the inside. Through January, February, and the first half of March 1967, the MiG-21 force did not engage American aircraft over North Vietnam. There was silence in the air war. On the American side, silence was read as victory. The bombing tempo over Hanoi intensified. American pilots began to operate as if the MiG threat had been broken, because as far as they could tell, it had been. Operation Rolling Thunder pressed deeper into North Vietnamese airspace. Struck packages flew, with less concern for escort coverage. The men of the 8th TFW carried Bolo as a campaign ribbon and a story. Cok, meanwhile, was in the classroom. He spent the grounding in the simulator, on the chalkboards, and in the briefing rooms. So did every surviving pilot of the 921st. They did not waste a moment on grief, but obsessively dissected the catastrophic failure, forging their loss into a lethal new tactical doctrine. When the regiment was declared ready to return to combat in the spring of 1967, it was no longer the regiment that had taken off on January 2nd. The men who climbed back into the MiG-21 cockpits had spent months understanding, in granular tactical detail, exactly how Robin Olds had taken out 5 of their friends. They had no intention of giving him a second opportunity. What they intended to do was hunt Americans on terms those Americans had never seen. With lessons learned, Cok was soon airborne again, flying as wingman to Flight Leader Nguyen Ngoc Do. They intercepted an F-105 strike package over northern North Vietnam on April 30th, 1967. Do downed an F-105F, whose crew, Major Leonard Thorsness and Captain Harold Johnson, ejected and were captured. Seconds later, Cok fired a single K-13 Atoll missile and destroyed an F-105D, piloted by Robert Abbott at the 355th Tactical Fighter Wing. Abbott was also taken prisoner. Minutes later, MiG-21 pilot Lê Trong Huyen downed a third Thunderchief. 3 F-105s were lost, with no MiGs down. The new doctrine worked on first contact. 4 days later, on May 4th, Cok nearly threw it all away. He was flying with Pham Thanh Nguyen when they intercepted another strike package. He attacked the F-105s, made his pass, and then made the kind of decision the new doctrine had been written specifically to prevent. He turned in on the F-4 escort. A Phantom missile struck his MiG-21 from behind. He nursed the burning aircraft back to Phuoc Yên and crash-landed beside the runway, almost the exact outcome of January 2nd. The same parachute scenario in slow motion. He learned. He never engaged on impulse again. 4 months later, 16 F-4s of the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing lifted off from Muban at dawn. The Wolfpack, the same wing that had run Bolo. The mission was a strike on the Yen Bien rail yard, 8 kilometers northeast of Hanoi, led by Colonel Nicholas Donaldson. The escort formation was led by Robin Olds personally. In the Phuoc Yên radar room, the controllers watched the formation cross the Black River and recognized it for what it was. F-4 escort signature, F-105 strike package behind it. It was the same operational pattern the regiment had been studying for 8 months. This time, the regiment was ready. The MiG-17s went first, 4 of them climbing out of the airfield at Gia Lam, vectored toward the F-105 formation from the south. They slashed in from below and to the side, the angle the new doctrine had specified for the older airframe, hitting the Thunderchiefs before the escorts could close the distance. The F-105s broke formation. Some of them jettisoned their bombs into the rice paddies, short of the target, and ran for the Black River. The strike package was already disintegrating before the F-4s could engage. The MiG-21s came down on the F-4s from above. Cok was in the lead element, climbing through the high overcast with 3 other MiG-21s. He'd been one of the wingmen of Bolo. He had ejected over these same rice paddies 8 months earlier. He'd spent the grounding in classrooms, on chalkboards, and in the simulator. Every parameter he'd been taught to verify before firing was being verified now. Altitude advantage, rear quarter geometry, surprise intact, K-13 inside 3 kilometers. So he fired. The Phantom ahead of him broke apart in the air, his second confirmed victory of the war. Around him, the rest of the doctrine was running its course. MiG-21s diving, firing, climbing back into the overcast. No turning fights, no second passes. No engagements held longer than the seconds required to release a missile and disengage. The Phantoms tried to convert into firing positions of their own and found themselves chasing aircraft that were no longer there. The MiGs were already 3 kilometers away and accelerating, the K-13s gone from their wing pylons, the airframes light and fast and pointed home. 3 F-4Ds went down. 3 Phantom crews ejected over the countryside that the Vietnamese controlled. The MiGs broke off and landed at Phuoc Yên with fuel to spare. Robin Olds returned to Ubon that afternoon. He had lost 3 of his Phantoms in an engagement that had lasted, by some accounts, less than 10 minutes. He'd been led into it by the same operational pattern he'd used to lead the 921st into Bolo. The pattern had not changed. What had changed was the regiment on the other side of it. The student had become the instructor. The instructor he had overtaken was Robin Olds. Same operation, same airspace, same wing that had nearly ended his life 8 months earlier. An extraordinary detail is that every single one of Cok's 9 confirmed victories across the entire war was scored with the K-13 Atoll missile. The K-13 was a Soviet weapon, but the Soviets had not designed it. They reverse-engineered it from an American AIM-9B Sidewinder that hit a Chinese MiG-17 over the Taiwan Strait in September 1958, lodged in the MiG's airframe, and failed to detonate. The Chinese pulled the missile out, handed it to the Soviets, and the Soviets took it apart. By 1962, copies were rolling off Soviet production lines. By 1965, they were hanging from the wing pylons of MiG-21s at Fujian. Cok was now using a Soviet missile, a copy of an American design, to shoot down the Americans who had nearly eliminated him with the very same technology. Cok followed this action by taking down at least 2 other American warplanes the following day. His method became signature. He flew to the rear quarter of his target, fired with surprise still intact, never accepted a turning fight, never engaged without altitude advantage. He was the inverse of the pilot he had been before Bolo. Cok kept climbing through 1968. On May 7th, flying with flight leader Dong Wook Woo, he intercepted a flight of F-4B Phantoms from VF-92, launched off the carrier USS Enterprise. He scored his 7th victory. The F-4B's pilot, Lieutenant Commander E.S. Christensen, and his radar intercept officer, Lieutenant Worth Kramer, ejected and were recovered by American forces. When Operation Rolling Thunder ended on October 31st, 1968, the air was effectively closed for him. There were no more American aircraft over Hanoi to shoot. By then, his confirmed tally stood at 9 American aircraft and 2 unmanned reconnaissance drones, more than any other pilot in the Vietnam War on either side. He was 26 years old. If you hold the 2 men against each other for a moment, Robin Olds finished his Vietnam tour with 4 confirmed MiG takedowns, 1 short of becoming a double ace. He returned home a celebrity. He was promoted to Brigadier General and was Commandant of Cadets at the U.S. Air Force Academy. He's remembered, deservedly, as the architect of the most successful tactical deception in the air war over Vietnam. Nguyễn Văn Cốc finished the war and stayed in uniform. He was transferred to the training academy in 1970, so his combat experience could be passed on to the next generation of Vietnamese pilots. Among the men he trained was Nguyen Duc Soat, who would himself become a MiG-21 ace. Cok remained in the Air Force he had nearly died to defend, and retired from it as a lieutenant general in 2002. His MiG-21, tail number Red 4326, stands today in the Vietnam People's Air Force Museum in Hanoi. The nose carries 13 victory marks, Cok's 9, plus 4 scored by other pilots who flew the same airframe. Visitors photograph it daily. Most of them have never heard of Robin Olds.